Greetings. Thank you very much. I am indeed delighted to be the chair of this extraordinary panel. We are going indeed to think outside the sandbox, and we were to see what are the benefits, what are the alternative, what are the problems and the challenges that regulatory sandboxes have in the context of promoting trustworthy artificial intelligence. And for that panel, I have the pleasure to introduce the panelists that are going to participate in the panel today. We have Norberto Andrade, Henrik Trasberg, Nguyen Trieu, and probably we'll have another panelist in the following minute. I'm going to be extremely brief in the introduction because I would like to ask the first question that is fundamental to understand what is this panel about. What is indeed a sandbox? And why we are today talking about sandbox in the context of the artificial intelligence regulation. Henrik, may I please give you the floor?
Thank you, Teresa. Happy to be part of this interesting panel discussion. Very briefly, just one sentence about me. I advise Estonian Ministry of Justice on regulatory matters concerning AI and new technologies. And I also participate in the negotiations of the EU AI Act in the European Union context, and I'm also involved in creating a regulatory sandbox for data-intensive technologies in Estonia. So very kind of brief comment on what we see as the concept of sandbox. In essence, we see it as a particular type of support service, which could facilitate that public and private sector projects would be compliant with laws, and that the significant risks that AI projects will bring about would be then sufficiently mitigated. So its essence is that there is a cooperation with experts from different fields, from data protection aspect, from data science aspect, from perhaps fundamental rights aspect, cybersecurity aspect, etc. And Sandbox would bring this expertise together. It would create a collaborative environment, and in this environment, it can be assessed what are the various risks related to a project, and what are also the concrete solutions that could be undertaken to lower these risks. And where appropriate, the solutions can also be tested in a real life environment, in a limited and controlled manner. So maybe that's a very brief introduction on what we see as Sandbox, and then I'll develop more my concept as we go on.
Thank you very much indeed for setting the scene. And now that we know what is the basic definition for discussion of sandbox, what is the real value? What is the importance that sandbox have? What are the benefits of sandbox, and who is benefited from sandbox? Norberto.
Thank you, Teresa, and thank you to the conference organizers for having me. Just a quick word also about myself. I'm Norberto Andrade. I'm a director in global policy lead for AI and digital ethics at Meta, and I'm also the founder of OpenLoop, which is a global initiative supported by Meta that promotes policy experimentation. And we do this together with a number of stakeholders spanning from regulators and industry peers to academics and civil society. So addressing your question directly, Teresa, I think in terms of value and benefits of regulatory sandbox, I would focus on two different angles. First is on regulatory sandboxes as mechanisms to reduce uncertainty and to enhance an evidence-based approach to policymaking. And the second angle would be how regulatory sandboxes and the emphasis that we now see on these specific tools are creating a momentum to actually think more systematically about policy experimentation. So in a way, regulatory sandboxes are opening the doors to actually think outside and beyond the sandbox, and we very much welcome this trend. But let me just start with this first element of reducing uncertainty. And the fact here is that the world is really becoming more complex, more complicated, more granular. There are increasingly more pathways and different and possible solutions in terms of technology and law. And this is basically increasing the space of uncertainty to understand actually what are the effects of both technical and regulatory systems in society. So there is the need for us to find ways to reduce this uncertainty, and we think that experimentation can be a very viable path towards this. So regulatory sandboxes really emerge as a powerful instrument to reduce this uncertainty, or to help reduce this uncertainty, and to foster a more evidence-based approach to the governance of new and emerging technologies. And I think this is particularly true in the field of artificial intelligence. We all know that AI is really emerging now as an area of lawmaking activity that presents a number of difficult questions around the variety of regulatory approaches, the scope, the coexistence and interplay with existing normative frameworks, also questions around accountability and enforcement. And also from a technical perspective, AI also poses additional challenges due to its intrinsic complexity, opacity, dynamic nature, and also the difficulties in measuring its impact. So this all compounds to this uncertainty that we believe we need to address through more and better policy experimentation. So that's why I think regulatory sandboxes are a very welcome instrument to this. Just very quickly, I would also mention that there is also a momentum that is being created to think more systematically about policy experimentation, and we think that the emphasis on regulatory sandboxes is really bringing experimentation to the forefront of policy making, and is boosting the application of further and additional experimental methodologies. I will talk more about other alternatives and complementarities to regulatory sandboxes, but I think that is important to see regulatory sandboxes as creating this momentum where experimental governance can become more anticipatory, more stakeholder inclusive, and more holistic. But more on that in a moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Norberto. Before giving the floor to Hui to add and collect some other views about the benefits and the value of sandboxes, let me please welcome Marco Alexander Breit to the panel. I will give you the floor in the following question, but I would like just to welcome you to joining the panel today on thinking outside the sandbox. Before going into details and talk about more in depth about how sandboxes represent a very, very effective alternative to other experimentation-based approaches, I would like to collect more other views about what are the benefits and the value of sandboxes. So Hui, would you like to add your thought on that, please?
Yeah, no, thanks a lot, Teresa, and thanks a lot to Breit for the invitation today. So in terms of quick intro, I'm a co-founder of a CFT, Center for Finance, Technology and Entrepreneurship. We're a global platform for fintech education. And in terms of my background, I've been an entrepreneur, banker, academic, and now entrepreneur again. And for the sake of this discussion, a few things that might be interesting. I was a co-creator of the Oxford FinTech course, the first online course of Oxford, co-creator of AI in Finance, also that has become the largest course about artificial intelligence in finance, and a founding partner of Supercharger, that became the largest FinTech accelerator in Asia. And so as part of this discussion on sandbox and the definition, fully agree with what Henrik said, I would say it is a controlled environment for innovation. And as a controlled environment for innovation, it is one of the tools, not the only tools, but one of the tools for innovation. And so if we think in terms of the benefits, I think there's, of course, quite a few benefits of sandboxes, especially in the space of AI, which can have a lot of ramifications and impact on society, on what we do. I think one of the potential benefits is that it allows to work on things that are hard to do in real life. For example, company collaboration. Company collaboration is usually hard because of all the reasons that we know. For example, sharing sets of data, system innovation, this can be quite difficult. Anything that requires collaboration can be hard. The second benefit, of course, coming from a private sector standpoint, is to be closer to the regulator and to be educated on how they think. But if we push a bit further, and here I'll make an analogy with accelerators, because for sandboxes, especially AI sandboxes are quite new at the moment. We have, however, the history of, let's say, 5-7 years accelerators, which were really tools also for innovation, and here innovation for corporate organizations. For example, at Supercharger, we had sponsors like Standard Chartered, Fidelity, Thomson Reuters. The objective for them was to accelerate innovation, was for the startups that were working with them, the objective was product development and time to market. What is the impact that we have seen? It has led to innovation, definitely. So we have seen solutions implemented, so definitely innovation that worked. In a lot of cases, however, it was more just, let's call that, no trials, no proof of concept, no prototype, so not real implementations. And so I think we really need to ask the questions of, do the benefits outweigh the cost, which might be cost in terms of time, money, resources involved? And I think that if we really drill down in terms of what were the benefits we got at the end, I think that one of very, very big benefits is that there was an explicit process for dialogue. And there was a real benefit in terms of structured approach to innovation for those large organizations, which is that if there were not those sandboxes, those accelerators, then basically it would have been very, very messy, for example, for a startup to talk to a large organization because you didn't really know who to talk to, for those large organizations to know how to structure their internal innovation. So there was a real benefit in terms of forcing the organization to have an explicit process for dialogue and a structured approach for innovation. And at the end of the day, that was really bringing two worlds together and leading to interdisciplinarity between regulators and technology. So I would say those are the main benefits.
Thank you, Hugh. That was very, very interesting because we have already on the table three main ideas that I like very much that you all raise related to the value and the importance of sandbox. The idea of learning, the idea of experimentation, and the idea of dialogue between the actors in the market and the regulators, the supervisors, the authorities that have to make the law or to regulate a particular innovation. So maybe the following question arising from these three ideas is, do we have alternative to sandboxes? What are other possible approaches inspired by similar ideas, by similar principles such as learning, experimentation, or dialogue that might be effective to combine with or to promote alternatively to sandboxes? May I please, Henrik, ask you about these other possibilities, these other approaches alternative to sandboxes?
Thank you, Teresa. I think it's a very interesting question, and our approach in Estonia has been towards that we shouldn't limit our focus to sandboxes only, and rather sandbox could be, let's say, a one kind of a support service in a larger toolbox for supporting this trustworthy and human-centered AI. And what it means is that our focus is not just to build a sandbox, but more generally to build a capacity for expertise. So what we are doing in Estonia, for example, is that there will hopefully exist this center of competence, or maybe more of a network of competences. It doesn't have to be centralized in one facility. And then this center or network of competences will bring together all of these different expertises from different fields that are relevant when we try to assess what would be the best way to apply these abstract rules that we have already in place or emerging with legislation such as the AI Act. So once we have this capacity, there can be different ways to channel this expertise in specific projects, right? So, for example, we are prototyping what we call a data panel, where the legal and technical expert from public sector would come together for one afternoon and discuss or provide insight into what would be the best solution in providing a specific data-intensive public services or specific service. Compared to Sandbox, it's a much more open discussion forum of what risks somebody sees. Everybody can get involved. So it's really this kind of an open discussion forum. But it really taps into the same expertise, the same capacity that we have already developed for Sandbox. So I think that's our viewpoint, that we try to have this capacity, and then it can invoke different forms of engagement with these data intensive projects.
Thank you, Henrik. Thank you very much. I would like to, because Norberto, you mentioned before that you wanted to elaborate on precisely this idea of alternative to sandboxes. But if I may, I would like to ask first to Marco Alexander about another element that we have to incorporate in deciding the effectiveness and the value of sandboxes. That is precisely what are the incentives that companies, in particular SMEs, have to participate in a sandbox, because apparently the value is evident. Clearly, the value and the benefit for the regulator is extremely significant and substantial. But maybe my question to you first, and then I would like to ask Norberto about precisely these two elements, incentive and also alternative. Marco Alexander, what are the incentives for the companies to participate in sandboxes, and how that could be an obstacle if there is no incentive?
First of all, thank you for having me and good day to all of you. I think that sandboxes are one of the most important parts that we as government officials or lawmakers can use to foster technologies. Why so? Because it's in the end, and especially when it comes to AI, it has been said that it has huge ramifications on people's lives, maybe on decisions that decide about people's futures. So we need to take careful steps. And in the end, it's about safety and security. People, citizens, they want safety and security. They want safety of their data. They want data security. They want their data to be as private as it gets. And on the other hand, there is companies, especially small and medium enterprises, they want to have safety and security when it comes to investment of resources, be them human resources or be them just plain money. They want to make sure that whatever they invest in the end not hindered by all of a sudden new regulation that kind of destroys the endeavors they have been taking for months or years now. So especially small and medium enterprises, they do not have the money to kind of invest in a bazillion of projects that might take off or not. They need to have very intelligent answers to the questions what their business will look like in the next years. So what do sandboxes do here? They give them an environment to try out these futures. They try out their ideas and do so, meanwhile, being able to influence the regulation, because whatever the sandboxes show will be part of the regulation and can be integrated in the process by us lawmakers or government officials. And the second thing is, even when they start within a controlled environment like a sandbox, they know whether this was a good idea on paper or whether it is a good idea in practice too. So in the end, I think sandboxes is the leap from stakeholder dialogues to sandboxes is less talking and more action. So in our experience, the sandbox approach is the most important tool we have, and this is why the German government has been endorsing it very strongly when it comes to the AI Act, which is negotiated within my department, and same as the Data Act. So we will see ideas like that in the future when it comes to data regulation in Europe.
Thank you very much, Marco Alexander. Norberto, are there other alternatives to sandboxes, as Henrik was explaining before? And do you see that this this question about incentive of companies to participate could precisely determine the succeed of a sandbox or alternatives to sandboxes?
Thanks. There's a very meaty question. Quickly on the alternatives and building on Henrik's remarks, we also believe that regulatory sandbox is part of tool. There are other tools and approaches that should be leveraged and implemented. Henrik mentioned this idea of prototyping a data panel, and what we've been doing at Meta through Open Loop is to champion a methodology called policy prototyping, and we believe that this is an additional experimental governance method that can complement actually regulatory sandboxes. So let me just take a couple minutes just to explain the difference between what is a regulatory sandbox and what is policy prototyping. They both, first of all, belong to what we can call the experimental governance family. They are sort of like cousins, that they to similar things, but they're actually different, and they operate in different contexts and in different regulatory environments. Regulatory sandboxes tend to operate in the context of existing legislation. They allow for the testing of technological innovations under a regulator's oversight, and they operate normally by granting specific temporary relief or an exemption of specific legal requirements, by creating a lighter regulatory environment for the participating companies in those sandboxes to operate within. So they are particularly useful when trying to reform existing rules to accommodate technological advances. And this has been particularly true in the field of fintech industry, as most of us know. Policy prototyping, on the other hand, they operate in the absence of existing legislation. They allow for regulatory experimentation when we are contemplating a new regulatory framework rather than merely updating an existing one to accommodate technology. So they are in a way less formalistic. They do not necessarily tackle a specific piece of existing legislation by making it less stringent. They actually test proposed governance frameworks before they are crystallized in legislation, or they co-create new governance frameworks that can inform lawmaking processes. Obviously, by operating in the absence of specific legislation, that does not mean that policy prototyping programs take place in a legal vacuum. Obviously, these exercises have to fit into existing legal and institutional frameworks in order to be legitimate and effective. One last, I think, advantage of the policy prototyping methodology is that it allows for a more holistic experimental governance platform. Through policy prototyping, we can examine and test both regulatory and non-regulatory instruments. And this is particularly useful in the field of AI, as it is very difficult to assess the most appropriate calibration between different governance instruments like laws, regulations, standards, ethical frameworks, codes of conduct, so on and so forth. So policy prototyping can provide a testing platform to explore these different combinations and calibrations among these different instruments. This is exactly what we've been doing through the Open Loop Consortium and Global Strategic Initiative. We've been promoting policy prototyping, and we've been working with a number of governments in co-creating new governance frameworks or testing existing ones. We'll give you the example of right now we are actually deploying an open loop program through which we are testing specific provisions of the EU AI Act, and with over 50 startups in Europe. And in the past and currently, we've been working with other governments like Mexico and Singapore on topics of transparency and expandability, India in terms of operationalization of AI ethical principles, and most recently also on privacy enhancing technologies in Uruguay and Brazil. I will just finish by just giving you a more pragmatic feel of what the policy prototyping is. Basically, we gather a number of companies, namely startups and SMEs. They are the participants. We then co-create we'll leverage existing ones that we call policy prototypes. We've been specifically focused on topics of artificial intelligence. So we have on the one hand the participants and then the policy prototypes. And once we have these two ingredients, what we do is ask the participants to apply those prototypes to their specific AI applications and business processes. And what we do is to collect the information of how they do so. And we try to evaluate how these policy prototypes actually fare in the real world, how they actually resonate in real world conditions, to understand, for example, how feasible they are, how costly they are, or how clear they are. And through all of these exercises, we derive policy recommendations to improve those policy prototypes and to shape the governance debate around AI, but also around other emerging technologies. I'll leave the incentives questions maybe later if we have time. It's already taken quite some time with this one.
No, thank you, Norberto. Has been extremely clarifying and illuminating this typology and the pragmatic and use cases that you explained to us. But please let me open another chapter in our discussion. That is the one related to privacy and data protection in relation to the sandbox. And I would like, Marco Alexander, I would like to ask you how sandboxes can comply with Personal Data Protection Act, and to which extent is a challenge and might be indeed a problem in the design and in the operation of sandboxes, or even limitation in the effectiveness of sandboxes.
I would, in my humble opinion, the question of data protection in sandboxes is a bit more, it's more like preemptive than whether the data is really protected within the sandbox. Why is that so? Because in the end, the sandbox gives relief from regulatory matters. That's correct. But on the other hand, as Norberto Andrade already said, it's for small and medium enterprises, they can check whether the product is valid and whether it is whether the resources it takes up are in any kind of relation with the revenue you can gather then. But when it comes to data protection, sandboxes are first and foremost a tool that gives confidence in the government's ability to regulate new technologies. Why is that so? Because if I have a controlled environment, and be it controlled because it's a single data space or some companies that work together, or be them a physical space where you can use drones to surveil, I don't know, traffic jams or whatever, then people, after the sandbox has been starting, after a few weeks, after a few months, get results and all the things, and people in the neighborhood or people from other data spaces or people from civil society, they might see that, okay, this is not held at loose. It is something that can contribute to the safety and transparency of AI systems that are being used by industry, by small, medium enterprise and whatever. But the most important part is that it's not a consumer and a citizen and his rights and his data, or her rights and her data. On the other hand, there is businesses that use AI systems. There are guys in the middle, right? There is not the consumer and the insurance company. There is somebody in the middle that offers the services, that AI system that the insurance company uses to assess the demands of its customers and its consumers. So what we need to take into account is that sandboxes are not only consumer and citizens, it's the man in the middle or the company in the middle too. And this is of huge importance because we have been talking a lot when we talked about the AI in Germany, and we put that position in the European perspective via the working group, that we need to have some certain rights for consumers that have been affected by a decision made or influenced by an AI system. Why so? Because having such a mechanism in effect adds a lot to the robustness and to the transparency of AI systems as a whole. And if people are confident with using AI, and when people are confident of being consumers and customers of companies that offer AI systems, then in the end, the sandbox has made a bigger impact by its results, and way more than the data protected within the short amount of time or a short or small place that has the sandbox that the sandbox created in the first place. I hope that was understandable, because it was a bit complicated to put all these things in perspective together.
Oh, thank you very much indeed. I would like to ask Henrik, would you like to complement from the perspective of the Estonian authorities this idea of sandboxes, AI, and privacy?
Yeah, sure. So, as we know, in many cases, AI, especially machine learning, is about being able to automatically identify these certain patterns or information from data, which is then used for decisions, actions, or supervision process. And that data very often will or has to include personal data. So and going forward, maybe things like use of synthetic data can somewhat help to reduce this processing of personal data. But it is clear that the bulk of personal data we have to collect and process will continue to rise in order to use artificial intelligence in ways that would bring about significant benefits. So so this development of AI clearly will have an increasingly strong interference with our privacy. So in Estonia, we have one project, I'll bring it as an example, which is about, it analyzes whether we should have personalized learning in schools. So there is this huge potential in giving students tasks in an order and with difficulty that is tailored to the students. It can really transform learning potentially. But to do that most likely means that we start to track and measure not only the tests that a student might take, but we start to track how a student from school day to school day solves various tasks on his or her device. Maybe track mouse movements, make assessments about students' concentration ability, etc. So in return of AI's potential, we are going to probably see much more invasive tracking of our actions and behavior. And so what we have to be careful about this is not to end up in a place where people feel they are stripped of their autonomy and privacy, and this feeling that somebody is tracking and measuring them at each moment. So the data protection rules are, of course, fundamental in order to limit the intrusion into this personal sphere of people. So I'll maybe briefly comment what the AI Act does, because Sandbox definitely helps there, because what Sandbox does, it obviously has this aspect of it helps to assess risks, and it helps to identify what could be a solution, and these risks and these solutions, they are among else about how do we lessen this kind of intrusion of privacy. So sandboxes definitely can have a big benefit there. AI regulation, of course, does more than that. We see, for example, that the AI Act bans certain practices that can be done using AI, such as social scoring of people, such as biometric identification of people in public spaces by law enforcement. And all of these elements, at the end of the day, they kind of help to make sure that this kind of intrusiveness doesn't go too far when we more and more start to introduce this AI-based processes into our daily lives. So yeah, maybe these are a few of my thoughts on how they interplay with each other.
Thank you very much. We are getting to a close. I will give you the floor immediately, Marco Alexander, in just in a minute. And before giving you the floor, I would like to open the last area for discussion, that is about governance of sandboxes. And my idea is to raise you three angles that we could discuss. So I give you the floor just openly to all of you, and you can add your views. The first is about how to ensure that the design and the regulation of sandboxes in all the different member states are duly harmonized. So to which extent we should promote the harmonization of the sandboxes regulation itself. The second angle that I would like to raise is to which extent we should leverage on existing resources in other innovation hubs, other data pools, in other projects that may help in designing this experimentation model in Europe. And the third angle is about skills. What are the skills that are needed to ensure that these the natural effect and the desired output of these sandboxes are indeed in the authorities that are designing, managing the sandboxes? So I would like to give you the floor, Marco Alexander. Don't hesitate to raise any other issues related to the previous comment, but if you could also add in your view this idea of governance of sandboxes.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. To be honest, the governance of sandboxes should be first and foremost contract that is established by the people that establish the project within the sandbox, and then the state kind of gives them leeway to do. Gives them leeway from existing regulation, but I don't think that I should intervene in the governance of sandboxes itself. But I want to be very precise about one thing that Henrik said, and this is something I would like to underline. The sandboxes, and on the other hand, forbidding or not allowing things like social scoring or mass surveillance via biometry is is a twofold approach. The AI Act is a risk-based approach, and it says that when we say we do not want social scoring and we do not want biometry, social surveillance, mass surveillance, then we give a lot of trust to our citizens, we give a lot of trust to consumers, and we give a lot of trust to just the plain people that are living in the EU, that we will hinder all these hugely impactful technologies that we can see somewhere else that negatively affect people's lives. But on the other hand, the sandboxes is a tool of enablement. It enables companies, especially small and medium enterprises, to take a bit of that risk away from them and give them opportunity to try out whatever they want to, as long as they stick to the rules and as long as this is not. And then there's the boundaries, social scoring, biometry, when it comes to mass surveillance and all the other things that will not be allowed in the European Union. But again, the sandbox is just a plain instrument of enablement, while forbidding technologies is an instrument of just giving security and trust to the people. As I said about the governance of sandboxes, I do not think that this is something that I should comment right now, because we are establishing the rules that allow sandboxes, and the governance of the sandbox itself should be made by the companies, in my opinion.
Thank you very much. We have exactly 3 minutes to conclude. So I would like just to, within this idea of governance, to give exactly 1 minute to each of you, Norberto, Henrik, and Hugh, and we conclude the panel in the next 3 minutes in order to be totally and fully on time. Norberto, please.
Thank you. So very quickly, just on the governance question, I would focus on the skills. And here I would give you some insights into what we've learned with the Open Loop program on the EU Act. We've asked, one of the provisions we tested was on human oversight. So basically, high-risk AI systems need to be designed in a way that can be effectively overseen. And we asked the participants, what would be that level of skill that is needed from the operators? And basically what they responded is that the providers, that they expect that the operators need to have a higher than average skill level. And we think that is a very relevant insight for the EU AI policy in general and the Act in particular, because it just denotes that there is a shortage of qualified AI workers in the EU. And then we need to see that requirement for human oversight as requiring that highly skilled workers that needs to be met by an increase of the pool of workers with technical skills in AI in Europe. So it was an important finding that I think points to the need to increase the bar in terms of skills and workers operating in this field.
Thank you, Norberto. Henrik.
I'll then take the question of should we have the harmonized approach to regulatory sandboxes across the European Union. It's a big debate right now at least in the EU Council. A strongly harmonized sandbox means that we have these clear conditions on what the project must provide in order to enter into the sandbox. We have clear knowledge how different authorities are involved in sandbox, when AI can be tested in real-world environment, etc. And this kind of a harmonized approach definitely makes a lot of sense. It allows us to build a strong cooperation mechanism between countries, to share insights, to share resources in tackling problems that really are the same in all countries. So there is a lot we can learn from each other. So good harmonization definitely can facilitate that. The counter argument that we are also seeing in these debates right now is that while harmonization is something we should seek, sandbox service is still in many ways in its infancy. So we perhaps don't yet know what kind of sandbox solution is the most effective and optimal. So if the harmonization results in a regulation of sandboxes that is very specific, the fear is that maybe we remove some of the flexibility to allow us to continue to learn and tinker towards what would be the most optimal way to set up the sandbox. So there is this balancing act that is currently kind of being negotiated in the concerning the AI Act, and well, we'll see how it pans out. But basically, that is the essence of the debate.
Thank you very much. Hui, can I give you the floor just to conclude I would say in a few seconds, but please take the minute if you wish to conclude.
Thanks a lot. So I think I'll finish just like Norberto on skills. And I like to say that AI is too important to leave it to data scientists. And I think everybody should be involved. When we analyzed 40,000 jobs in fintech at the beginning of the year for the fintech job report, we found that 80% of the jobs in fintech are jobs of tech companies and not of finance. And so basically, all industries are moving into this world. And the very big misconception is that AI is hard skills, Python, etc. It is not. Of course, it can be, but the reality is that it's for everybody to understand. For example, as a regulator, I think, or supervisor, they should be able to understand, for example, if we want to detect anomalies like fraud detection, what's the difference between supervised and unsupervised learning? This is not hard data science, but I think it is really important. And I think it is important even more today because we don't want to replicate I would say all the miscommunications we've had with the internet, where, for example, 20 years after the creation of Google, we still had some policymakers, so not in Europe, but we still had some policymakers who didn't understand what was data monetization. So I think really, really important that everybody understands what it is at all levels of the organizations.
Thank you very much. It has been a great pleasure for me to be with you today. It has an excellent panel, thought-provoking and very insightful. We have been thinking outside the box and beyond sandboxes in the context of the Artificial Intelligence Act in Europe. Thank you very much, and we conclude the panel.